Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, a podcast by MedComms experts. We share medical communications insights and advice from the best and brightest in the industry to find out what they're doing to push our industry forward. Here's your host, Wesley Portegies.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, the podcast where we explore bold ideas that shape the future of medical affairs. Today, I'm really excited that we're joined by Kristen Thomas. She is a board-certified oncology pharmacist and also a director of Oncology Scientific Communications at Pfizer. Kristen brings a unique perspective to medical communications, especially as she has a background in journalism and applies some of those learnings from her time in journalism to her current work in medical communications. So in this episode, we're going to dive into Kristen's journey from journalism to pharmacy to medical communications and talk about how she's applying some of those techniques, for instance, storytelling, during her time as a journalist to data dissemination and how she brings that into her innovative approach to medical communications. Kristen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Absolutely. So, Kristen, why don't we start with some background here? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you did in journalism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely have a strange journey to my current position. I have an undergrad degree in communications with a focus in print journalism and a minor in theater, which I don't use again right now, but still a lot of fun. And I was a full-time print journalist. So I started out in magazines, and then I went to become a beat reporter for a daily newspaper. And I did that for 5 years before I decided to go back to school and get my doctorate in pharmacy. And then from there, I spent 8 years as a clinician. I did a residency and focused in oncology, got my board certification, and stayed in that setting in the hospital for 8 years before I decided to make the move to industry. And I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for the last 5 years. As you mentioned in the intro, I work at Pfizer now in medical communications. So it's kind of been a long, strange path, but it all makes sense in the end, actually. And I use all those skills on a daily basis now. So this job really turned out to be a perfect marriage of my two backgrounds.
Wow, that's amazing. What prompted you to become a pharmacist, being a journalist?
Yeah, so this is a kind of a strange story, but I'd always been interested in science. I was good at science in school, did a lot with chemistry, enjoyed that part of things, the molecular level of things. And I was also very interested in oncology. So even when I was a journalist, I volunteered at the American Cancer Society. I used to write for their newsletter, so using my skills there. But then my husband was actually getting his doctorate. He's a chemical engineer. So we were in Austin, Texas for a few years while he did that. And his research is in drug delivery systems. So he was dual advised in pharmacy and chemical engineering. And I just found that fascinating. It was just a really interesting part of science that I enjoyed anyway. And then I found out you could specialize in oncology. So it was a little spark there in the back of my mind. When he completed his PhD, we moved back to Tennessee from Austin, Texas. And at the time, they were starting a pharmacy school where I lived in Eastern Tennessee. So it felt just perfect timing. I obviously had to go back and spend a few years taking some prerequisites because you don't really need to take a lot of science in your journalism degree. But after a couple of years, was able to get into pharmacy school and just decided to make the leap.
Wow, that's such an amazing story. I think there's always so much value into bringing those different skills into your next endeavors. I'm someone who also has a strange career path. I was supposed to be an electrician and end up running a medical communications agency. Not much use for the electrician part of it, but at least I can keep the power on when I need to.
That's a good skill to have. I could have used that a couple of weeks ago when our air conditioning went out.
Exactly. Okay, so then you entered at a certain point into medical communications. Now, tell us a bit more about how you're blending these different skill sets together. And actually, I'm referring both to your journalistic skill set, but also you're part of being a clinician and now being actually on the industry side.
Yeah, it seems like it was a natural progression for me, just coming from that communication background, then switching to become a clinician. That was kind of a bigger jump, I would say, than going from being a clinician to industry and medical communications. It's a different mindset when you're facing the science and you're looking at a patient on a daily basis and, what treatment they're going to get and how's this going to affect their life and their quality of life. So I think that was a much bigger leap for me than moving from there into the MedComms side of things. But I think all the skills are still transferable because no matter what, I mean, you probably found this in your life too, but the most successful people in whatever realm they are practicing in and whatever career they have are good communicators. Because at the end of the day, you really need to get your point across, whether that's to a reader in the magazine or the newspaper you're writing for, whether that's a physician that you're trying to convince that they need to change someone's chemo regimen because, you know, their kidneys aren't working as well, or whether that's an audience at a huge congress that you want to see this new data that's coming out. So I think that it was a natural progression, and those communication skills just kind of run across as a theme no matter where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's a key skill to have. And I also think it is so important for people in our industry to have been on the front of care delivery, healthcare delivery, right? So if you go 5 years back in your mind and you entered the industry for the first time, did you have any like particular observations, things that maybe surprised you or that you felt were maybe misaligned with the actual real life healthcare delivery that you have been in?
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right that it is important that people have been in the other side of things because it's a different thought process when you've worked with the patients hands-on, when you've been in the hospital, when you've seen those patients, especially for me being in oncology, patients with cancer and their caregivers and what they're actually going through on a daily basis and insurance issues and all those real life things that you don't necessarily know if you've never been there yourself. So it was surprising to me. I think that not everyone came that path. I mean, there are different paths to everywhere and everyone has valuable resources or perspectives that they can bring. But I think the fact that not everyone had that experience and therefore couldn't put themselves in the shoes of the patients in the real world always, I think that was definitely a surprise to me. And I think the people that are really good at their jobs had some experience, whether that was as a caregiver themselves or working in a hospital or, you know, working in some other setting that they can bring a different perspective. That was definitely interesting to see and helpful when you have a bunch of different backgrounds to come together. That was definitely surprising to me. But also, I think those people that are really good at science aren't necessarily naturally good communicators. And you don't get training in that in pharmacy or school or medical school necessarily. I think we had one semester in my 4 years of pharmacy school of basically communicating with others. We did a joint class with the medical school that was at my school. And so, you know, we practiced and we talked to people that were like fake clinicians and fake patients, but not everybody gets that. And one semester is not enough. So you can be as great at science and not be able to get your point across. So that was also surprising.
Yeah. No, I can see that. And I share some of those observations as well. And I mean, like, honestly, that is what my company does as well, right? Like, we work with so many brilliant people and they're amazing scientists. They know their data inside out. But when it comes to communicating, yeah, there's a whole other world that is needed in order to bring that data to your audience in a way that is humanized, right? And I think, like, as an industry, it is all about the data all the time. But sometimes we get so caught up into it that we forget there's people behind this, both the HCP and the patients, right? That we need to consider their world and that they're working with real humans, with real problems that need to be addressed. And therefore, the whole concept of storytelling has been so instrumental lately. I'm wondering about, as a journalist, I'm assuming there's a lot of techniques that you can use to kind of resonate with your audience or relate to your audience better. And I'm wondering if you could maybe share some secret tricks with us from the journalism side that you apply in medical communications or could apply in medical communications.
I think one thing that I took away from journalism that I use in my daily medical communications life is knowing the importance of a good lead. When you read a newspaper article or a magazine article, you have a few seconds to kind of hook that person. They're looking at the magazine, they're looking at the newspaper, and they decide in those first few sentences whether or not they're going to read this whole article, right? So good leads in journalism are concise, they're clear, they're very eye-catching, and they engage the audience immediately. And I think that's something that we can really apply to medical communications. I think it all goes back to kind of that elevator pitch, right? So you only have a few minutes to tell them what's the most important thing, and you want that to be at the top. So understanding that when you're creating a poster or a presentation or a manuscript, I think that's really key. Be clear and hook the audience at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a great one, actually. And it made me think about like IMRAD, like introduction, methodology, results, and so on. And by the kind of academic training that we get used to communicate with terms like that, and there's nothing wrong with it from a scientific perspective, of course, but I can also see, like, if I imagine a slide deck and there's a title, like what we typically recommend is turn the title in some kind of conclusion. So what does this slide mean? If you could only take one thing away, the title should already tell you that. That's what you're referring to here, right?
Yeah, and my mentor, I think, said it best. So I had a mentor that I worked with in the hospital that was also my residency program director. And whenever we were doing presentations as residents, she would always say, why do we care? That's a take-home point for everything. Why do we care? Why does the audience care? And whether that's the title or the first slide, you really want to drive that point home first. I think ASCO actually started doing, at the beginning of all their presentations, you have basically a take-home slide. And I think that's kind of a great way to get this across because, again, somebody's going to go home from this conference and they're not going to have been able to attend every single session that was there. So if they have one slide that they can look at, then they can decide if they want to dig deeper into this data, if they want to pick up the manuscript, if they want to listen to the presentation online. And I think that's really important for us as medical communications professionals to recognize that people don't have a lot of time. So we need to make sure we hook them at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when you talk about hook 'em at the beginning, I'm thinking about like a fishing hook, right? Like you kind of want to reel them in, which also means that while you want to maybe describe the conclusion, it's also important to maybe sometimes like provoke the audience a little bit, right? Like create some curiosity. So tell me a bit more about the tricks of setting the most amazing titles that works best.
Well, a lot of people use puns and things now. You've seen a lot of scientific communications that are kind of funny plays on song titles or just silly puns, which that's one way to do it. That makes it a little more interesting. That aside, I think, you can just kind of think about your audience, think about what they're interested in, and then try to focus on that. And whether that's a funny title or a great first line or even, enhanced publication content, something visual that you can throw in there, like a data visualization or an infographic that can really grab your audience at the beginning and make it a little more unique than just your standard presentation with a KM curve here and there.
Yeah, absolutely. Another topic here that I'm wondering about is that I think journalists are generally very good at creating some kind of emotion in you, right? When you read an article, it's like you really feel something about it. It's not just like a dry observation of facts. While in our industry, that is, of course, the risk with all the kind of dry data that we have to present. So any suggestions on that? Like, how can we turn data into more humanized stories that don't only educate the brain, but maybe also the heart?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and something that we struggle with, at least on the pharmaceutical industry side of things, because we have a ton of regulations that we have to deal with. And obviously, we want to balance the scientific accuracy with the storytelling piece of it, which is not always easy, honestly. So I think at first you have to think about your audience. Who are you talking to and what's going to appeal to them? And then think about, is there an innovative way I can go about getting the message across? So whether that's including a patient author, perhaps, let someone tell their own story, because inherently, that human side of things is much more compelling than just reading a chart with a bunch of data in it. So I think that's important. And it's equivalent to using a great quote in a journalism story when you can have someone that's been there and that can tell that story. So I think that's one way to do it. And I think another way is that visual aspect of things, or auditory, where you have a physician telling the story, perhaps on a podcast like this, or just discussing the information on a more human level. That makes it more digestible for the audience, I think, and brings it real, especially if the physician or the nurse practitioner or the pharmacist can talk about how they manage these patients with these diseases. Then that humanizes this just information on a page. So I think that's important. And it may not be right for every audience. Obviously, I can't have a patient come up and give my plenary presentation at a huge congress, but it's a great way to enhance what you're already getting across. Obviously, great data starts and ends with, medical communications. You've got to have the data to back it up. But at the same time, you can find ways to make it personal.
I really like that. And you started your answer with, you need to know what your audience needs or wants, right?
Absolutely.
How to go about that?
I think it's really nice if you've been a clinician or if you've been a caregiver, because you can put yourself in those shoes. So whenever I'm looking at what we're going to present next or what we're going to put out in the world, I try to think, me as a clinician, what did I want to know? What were the take-home points that were important to me? What was the focus of this? And as a pharmacist, a lot of that was, looking at how we manage side effects or how we dose adjust. So those aspects were important to me. So if I'm speaking to a pharmacist audience, I might focus on those aspects of things. Whereas the physician wants to know the data and how's it going to affect their patient? Is it going to make a difference in their survival, their quality of life? And the patient wants to know, how's this going to affect the way I live now? One, am I going to get a cure? Am I going to have a longer life? But also, am I going to be able to live a quality life? So I think it's important to kind of tailor based on that and put yourself in their shoes. That makes a difference in what you're saying at the end of the day.
Is MedComms evolving faster than your team can keep up? You're not alone, and you don't have to navigate it alone. Wesley Portegies, host of Transforming Medical Communications, is offering a limited number of 30-minute consultancy sessions for senior medical affairs professionals. Whether it's medical communications, field medical, or medical affairs training, these sessions are a chance to explore real-world challenges, pressure test ideas, and walk away with practical strategic insight. No fluff, just strategy. Book your free session now. Link is in the show notes.
Now, of course, not everyone has had the privilege or the opportunity to be on the clinical practice side of things before getting into MedCom. So how could people get a better understanding of that?
Yeah, I think listening, talking to people, that's key. Even if you're in the field medical, you go out and you talk to clinicians all day, talk to patients, get their perspective on things and understand what they want. You can also talk to the people if you're looking at a third-party platform to put across some information, figure out who their audience is and if that fits with the plan that you need. Because I think where you go is also as important as how you present things most of the time. So if I'm targeting a pharmacist audience, I might go with my presentation to the Hematology Oncology Pharmacy Association meeting versus ASCO because I know pharmacists are going to be there, or I might target a patient track at a meeting. So I think it's important to talk to people, talk to your audience, and figure out what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. When I think about journalism versus medical communications, is that in journalism, you always need to find ways to have different angles on the same topic, right? So when you have a topic, you need to milk it a little bit. And in medical communications, we would like the same. But what I very often see actually in practice is that we tend to be very exhaustive and comprehensive communicators, right? Just look at a scientific poster, right?
Absolutely.
Or anything else that we create for that matter. It's often just everything we could possibly communicate about the topic we try to cram into every asset. While media seems to parcel this out a little bit more so they can create a longer duration of communications and multiple touch points, use different channels and these kind of things. I was just wondering on your view on that.
I think you're right. I think we're not very good at doing that, but it's important because once again, people don't want to spend 30 minutes reading a poster with tiny font. And you're not going to get across any of the secondary points that you were trying to get across to begin with if you cram it all in there. So I think if we think about how people get their information these days, we all have smartphones in our pockets. Everything is bite size. Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, TikTok, all of these media are meant to be kind of short, fast bites of information. And everybody's busy and everybody's used to getting their information like that now. So I think we need to adapt to that in MedComms. And one way of doing that is separating out our information so that you have 1 or 2 or 3 take-home points versus 15 take-home points in whatever you're putting out into the world. And I think that also makes it a little easier because a physician might have 5 minutes today to read your paper and maybe they have 5 minutes tomorrow. So perhaps today they read the manuscript and tomorrow they look at your data visualization and the next day they read a transcript of something that talks about how to manage side effects. So it's not only good for us because it spreads out that communication and kind of keeps your data top of mind, but it also kind of meets people where they are and how they're used to getting their information these days. And, there was a survey a couple of years ago that talked about how people like to get their information, how physicians like to get their information. And that bite-sized content was at the top of the list. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we're putting out things into the world. People aren't going to sit there and read a 20-page manuscript in one setting. So if you put all of your points in it at once, probably no one's going to take those home with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I've observed over the last decade or so a clear trend towards that kind of short form content, as we call it, publication extenders. It's actually a topic I'm very passionate about and I've given a lot of presentations about. And I think part one was like creating short form content on its own. And I feel the next iteration of this concept is where not everything needs to be a summary, right? So even though we want to communicate holistically around a publication, I think we should take the SCP, look at the different messages we have or that we want to communicate and align that and make that maybe different pieces. So there could still be a holistic summary of the publication, but I think certain pieces as extenders can also serve to highlight one specific aspect. Like one could be focusing the quality of life and another one could be efficacy and safety, or I don't know, these are just some rough examples. But I think there's a lot to be learned from media and from journalism when it comes to editorial planning and also how you can spark your mind to come up with multiple topics around the same topic, right? So how can you actually keep the story going and how can you project that over like a timeline, see different angles that may resonate with different audiences as well. So I think it's definitely an extremely useful capability to have in medical communications.
Absolutely. And I think if you look at magazines or newspapers that do series, that's a great analogous situation. They're not going to tell you the whole story right up front. You may have to read 5 or 6 different things to get the story, but it's more compelling that way and it hooks you in. So I think that's 100% something we can learn from the media and something that can apply in this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also not to be underestimated. It's actually really hard to do. Like, I mean, even us sitting here and recording this episode together, I have 2 episodes a month. I could record like 1-2 hour episodes and tell everything that we think about medical communications. But then it would be probably not as successful of a podcast over time.
You're out of topics after 2 months.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just important to really think that through. It's like, okay, what does the audience actually need? What I'm hearing in the market? What are kind of problems that clients have been telling me about recently? And that way you can keep also a lot of variety in your messaging and always come up with something new and a different feel on things.
Yeah, 100%. Because it's easy just to do the same thing over and over.
Yeah. Now, the other part is the formats, right? And I was wondering if you could share any experiences from your end, like with some more innovative formats you may have tried recently.
We've had a lot of success with data visualization and interactive data visualization to accompany our manuscripts. I think this is kind of an interesting way of doing things because you can click on a link, go to a microsite, and see kind of an interactive infographic that people can actually touch and see and drill down on the data. But it's also a great way that the physician can bring this to their patients and show them in the room. So if you have an iPad, I used to round with my iPad, you can go into a patient's room and say, this is the treatment you're getting. And here's what it looked like in real life. These patients that got the treatment did a lot better. You can see on this graph and kind of scroll through it. So I think that has been something that's been very successful that we've done with several different papers. And something that's maybe a little underutilized, but again, you have to consider your audience. Not every paper deserves an interactive infographic or a data visualization, but it's been really good for our primary data to come out something that people can really interact with, a small bite that summarizes and then hits the key points and then gives you the ability to look a little more detail into where you're interested and where you're not. So that's been one thing. And then I think plain language summaries has been another one that a lot of people do now, but I think is helpful as well. It's a way to not only look at the complex data in an easier way to understand, so perhaps you can use that for your patients, but maybe you also use it for physicians that don't see these patients all the time. Maybe you're not super familiar with a B600E mutated melanoma and you see one of those patients every few years. This is a way that you can kind of get a summary or an easier way to digest that information without reading the primary manuscript. So that's been pretty successful. And we've also done translations of those in conjunction with various journals. So that's been helpful. It's something that physicians can use to pass out to their patients that English may not be their first language, just to kind of meet them where they are so they have something to read that's on their level and in their native language. So those of all have been pretty helpful. And then we're on a podcast, but podcasts have been very good, and short podcasts as well. So, we've really focused on perhaps a 10-minute chunk. And we've done a few with physicians discussing why data is important. So take home points. But then also we've done a few, some of my colleagues have done some with patients and talking about their experiences with particular regimens or particular disease states and kind of how they managed their side effects and how those regimens affected them. So I think those have all been some good, successful ways of presenting the data in a different manner. And I think at the end of the day, you have to, again, think about your audience and what's going to resonate with them. And maybe you do more than one for a set of data, because some people are visual learners and some people are auditory learners, and some people want to go on a jog and listen to a medical podcast perhaps. So I think that's all important, because you have to think about how people are going to use this in real life.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because this is what I'm saying all the time, that we have a way of thinking singularly in the industry about okay, we have a publication, let's make an infographics. Like why don't we think about something more we could do, right? How can we get as much out of this as we can to really get this data to the physicians? Because there's a lot of information out there that a lot of them don't actually get to read the publications that much anymore. So these other channels are becoming more and more important. So thank you for advocating for that. I think it's extremely important. I have a few questions about the different formats that you called out here. The data visualization, the microsite that you mentioned, is that like an industry-owned microsite, or is that like on the publisher side of things?
We've done it a few ways, but we most recently have been working with the same vendor that does our publications, and they put together the microsite. So then we own the copyright and they manage it for us. So that's been really nice. If you work at all with field medical, then we were able to kind of put that through our legal department and get that approved. So it's something that field medical can show when they go out into the field and talk to physicians and pharmacists and nurses. So that's been really helpful and very nice to actually own that information. You can do it different ways, obviously, but that's worked best for us. We've done different visualization techniques or infographics that were owned by the publisher, and it's just not as flexible for us because we don't own the rights to it. So the more you can work with, the more you can do with that content, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. But then you were still able to link out from the publication, because I am, by the way, completely on board with the concept that certain things you kind of need to keep owned media, as they say, right? And shouldn't give to the publishers. But now, how do you make the link from the publication to that particular interactive data visualization?
We've done this several times with different publications, and it's been different every single time. So ultimately, you have to work with the publisher at the beginning and just kind of set expectations and see if they're willing to work with you and if they're willing to put the link in there and how they want to display the link. So we've had it done a whole bunch of different ways. The first time that I had a data visualization dashboard was a couple years ago, and it was actually in the references. So they kind of used it as a reference to go with the publication. We've had it in the abstract, linking out to that. We've had it accompanying it on the side. We've had it completely not linked in the publication at all and just had it separately on a microsite that we linked out from our company website. So we have a medical website, and we put a link to it next to the link to the publication on the medical website. And we've used Figshare also to house it. So we've explored a variety of different ways. Looking back at the metrics, interestingly enough, the one that was in the references has had the highest traffic over time, and it kind of maintained. I don't know why. You would think it would actually not be that much traffic because it wasn't as prominently displayed next to the publication or what have you, but the audience just really enjoyed that, and it was a little bit more novel at the time, so perhaps that's why we got more traffic. But the more prominently you can display it, I think the better. The first attempt aside. But yeah, we've done it a variety of ways. It's worked differently each time. And I don't know, you just have to kind of explore what works for you. Figshare is a decent option if you don't have anywhere else to kind of host it and you want to send people to link to something like that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's super practical advice. I'm sure a lot of people will appreciate that. And then the other format you mentioned that I'm really interested in is the podcast part. I have observed some of the same things, like especially the shorter podcast format, like under 10 minutes. That seems to be kind of the critical tipping point. Well, I was wondering about, and this, again, ties a little bit back to your journalism background here. It's like, how can we make these more exciting? Because ultimately, we're often talking about data. And I heard you mention a few ideas already there, but I was hoping we could maybe delve into a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the more variety you have in who's speaking, the better, at least in my experience. And the podcasts that my colleagues have done with patients have been really great because not only is that a different perspective on things, but it also is something that patient advocacy groups can look at and use to give to their members. And so I think that's been really interesting and really cool, just thinking about a different perspective. So it's not always just a physician that was the first author on the paper that's talking about it. Another perspective that we've done is more of a community practitioner. So a lot of our content as a pharmaceutical company is coming from big academic sites and key KOLs or physicians that are in these big academic centers. But that's not everyone's experience. That's not where people get their treatment always. And that's not where people are practicing always. There are a lot of people in community that see every different tumor type that's out there, and they need a variety of information on a daily basis because they might be seeing a pancreatic patient and then a leukemia patient and then a colorectal cancer patient all in the same day. So I think that's been great too, just getting the perspective from someone that sees a variety of different patients and works in a setting that's a little bit different. They're not specialized as much as our academic clinicians are. So I think that's been helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very useful input. One other aspect I was wondering about, though, was the dissemination. So where do you actually put these podcasts?
We've done a variety of different things with that as well. So there are several journals that offer peer-reviewed podcasts. And I think that's great, not only because it gives you a chance to maintain that scientific rigor. So going through the peer review podcast process, you have a transcript that gets peer reviewed and an outline that gets peer reviewed. So you make sure everything is accurate as well as engaging, which I think is very important and something that as a big pharma company, we look at. We want the information to be engaging, but we also need it to be accurate. So that's been really good. There's several different journals that do that. We've also done some in-house. So my content folks have put together some podcasts kind of working with the internal team. And those are more housed on the internal websites or our medical-facing website. That's the company website. So a little bit different, but you can also review the content to make sure it's accurate with your data and everything. I prefer the peer-reviewed route just because it's more vetted and you have other eyes on it. So it's not just your perspective and not just that physician's perspective. You really get someone to look at it and say, can you speak more about this? Or is this a section that we can take out kind of thing? The more eyes you have on something before you put it out in the world, the better, I think, because different perspectives make better content.
Yeah. I was wondering, have you ever used traditional podcast channels like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and these kind of things, and just like basically created a show for an external audience?
I haven't personally, but I have a lot of friends that go about it that way. There are some specific podcasts for pharmacists that are out there that we all kind of love and listen to, and physicians. So yes, that is absolutely a great way to go. I think we have a little bit more challenges coming from big pharma because, we have guardrails that we have to fall in line with when we're putting out content. And it's both great from an aspect of, yes, you have that scientific rigor and you want to make sure that's maintained, but also can be a little frustrating when you're trying to do something a little more innovative or outside of the box, because you really do have to think about the legal aspect of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. MLR is always a big challenge, right? But
for sure,
I definitely see a lot of progress in what's possible nowadays. And I think as an industry, we are really moving forward. So that's amazing. So time is flying when you're having fun. So we're getting to the end of our recording here today. But before we stop, if there were like one particular strategy, tactic, or trick that you could share with your colleagues, what is something that you would recommend?
I think probably my number one take-home point all goes back to that why do we care question. And so I would say, to borrow a journalism trope, don't bury the lead. So make sure you're telling everyone exactly what you want them to know up front. And that makes a great story because it sucks them in right from the beginning and then makes them want to read the rest. And I think that's important and something we can learn from the journalism world.
I think that's some wonderful advice. I'm looking forward to seeing people apply it as well. So, Kristen, thank you so much for your time here today, for sharing all your insights. I think it was amazing to hear how you have been through all the different career directions in your life and how you're combining these in medical communications to inform HCPs well and make sure patients get the best treatment as well. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you for your time here on the show today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Absolutely.
Transforming Medical Communications is brought to you by MedComms Experts. To find out more about MedComms Experts and how we create some of the most cutting-edge medical communications programs anywhere in the world, visit www.medcoms-experts.com. And then make sure to search for Transforming Medical Communications in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MedComms Experts, thanks for listening.